The most common question that I get asked by students studying for their GCSE in English language is, how do I improve my vocabulary? In other words, how do I grow the number of words that I can use? And there's no quick fixes, unfortunately. So I often say to students, there's not a magic potion you can take that will suddenly give you the dictionary in your head. It takes time. And that's the disclaimer that I want to give at the beginning of this video. So in this video, I'm going to give you perhaps 9 ways in order to begin your journey in terms of learning some new vocabulary. But the main disclaimer is that it takes many months, if not years, to expand your vocabulary. Even adults who left school years ago are still learning new words because there's so many words out there. So I'm not suggesting for 1 second that by watching this video, you're going to suddenly be able to use, a lot more words. It doesn't happen like that, unfortunately. It's like learning to play an instrument. You can't just pick up a trumpet and expect to be able to play in an orchestra tomorrow. It takes longer. So it's something to practice. So that's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer in terms of GCSE writing tasks, particularly descriptive writing or story writing, is that students are often told that they need to have sophisticated vocabulary. And what happens is it shows in their writing. And one of the things that you'll notice if you read examiners' reports for the GCSE exams, which are written by examiners after the marking process, so in September or August, examiners will often say that students were trying too hard to be too fancy with their vocabulary. So an example is a student was writing a piece of description and they randomly and suddenly used the word discombobulated. And what the examiner says is it actually detracts from the coherence and clarity of their writing, because good writing is writing that's clear. And if a student gives the impression that they've swallowed a dictionary or a thesaurus, it actually takes away the clarity of the writing. And it shows the student trying too hard to write more complex vocabulary. So there's a fine line between using confident vocabulary and going over the top with it. And what I'm not suggesting is I want students to be giving, a thesaurus in their writing. That's not the point of this. So this is the start of the process to perhaps grow the number of words you want to have in your brain. But you've got to allow yourself time for your brain to be exposed to those words in order to use them. And it's sometimes just not enough to read. That's a good thing to do, but it's about then how do you actively engage in that reading process. So out of the 9 strategies in this video, they're all relatively simple, but they would all require something from you in order to grow your vocabulary if you're serious about doing so. So the first strategy is to read something critically every day. What I mean by critically is to engage actively in what you're reading. So every day you could read a couple of pages of a novel or a short story, or read a newspaper article, which is useful because it helps you understand what's going on in the world, which might help with a non-fiction writing task. And take a highlighter or pen and circle or highlight 2 words in that article or in that book that you don't understand. You can then look them up in a dictionary or on Google and write down the definitions. When you're writing down the definition, you can also include the word type, adjective, verb, and adverb, and that might also help with language analysis. Once you've figured out the definition and you know what the word means, you can then write your own sentence using the word. So you're taking the definition and you're putting it in your own context. And then at the end of the week, after 7 days, you've got 14 words there that you've been using and 14 words that you can then learn. And that will, of course, over time, grow potentially your vocabulary. So yesterday, to give you an example, there was a story in the news about how Mars bars are going to be trialing, how Mars are going to be trialing to put their Mars bars in paper wrappers instead of plastic ones. And in that article, the beginning of it, I highlighted the words recyclable, traditional, and adequate. You can see in the boxes around the outside, I've put the word type, they're all adjectives. I then put the definition, and then in the different font, I've put in how I'm using that word in my own sentence. And by doing that, my brain is more likely to remember what that word means because I'm putting it within my own context. So this is all about comprehension, and this is often a strategy that I have seen um, language classes use, for example, for students that are learning English as a second language. So non-native speakers, all about comprehension, all about meanings. Of course, we can only use words in the right context if we know the meanings of the words. And so this is helping with that as well. So this is what I mean by engaging critically and actively with something, by taking a highlighter and engaging with it in your own kind of context. The second strategy is to have fun with word games. Words are fun. I'm going to say that as an English teacher. But words aren't just scary things. We use words every day, verbally. We use them in our text messages all the time and in conversation and so on. So when we go into English lessons, we then get scared of words. And it's interesting because we might have just used a word outside in the playground, and now we're in an English lesson, we're scared of using words. So, but there are a lot of things out there that you can do which are designed to take the scariness of words away, like word games, countdown, Scrabble, word searches. There are obviously lots of apps on our phones now that are word or letter based. And if you wanted to be slightly more creative, you could cut out paper squares, put a letter on each of those squares, a bit like Scrabble. Pull out those squares at random and try and make the longest word from the letters you pull out of a bowl, for example. So words are fun. They're supposed to be something that are creative and something that you can have fun with. They're not supposed to be scary. And you can have a lot of fun with them in terms of games. You can make them into competitions and so on. So there's that possible idea as well. Third, poetry. Poetry is useful because poetry is concise and relatively short. And because it's short, in this case, I'm not too worried about pulling poems apart, which I know students get a bit fed up with, and I think there's a fine line sometimes by just pulling them apart too much. Poetry is designed to be read, um, and therefore enjoyed on a language level for first and foremost. And of course, for English literature, you might have already looked at some poems. And again, very similar to the first strategy, to actively engage with those poems, to circle words, look them up, and then to use those own words in your sentence as well. So poetry can also be concise to use, and I do that with my students sometimes as well. I find a short poem and we look at it from a language level, looking at things like connotations and things. The fourth thing is just to practice synonyms. So you could draw yourself a spider diagram like this, and you could put the word in the middle. So we've got two adjectives here, bad and scary. And then around the outside, you can collect some words, synonyms of bad, for example, and then synonyms for scary. And the synonyms are often going to be slightly more complex, perhaps, than the middle word. And again, you can then say, okay, well, I'm going to learn two of these words because I might then use them in a piece of descriptive writing, maybe. So synonyms, alternative words, words that mean the same thing. The fifth thing takes the longest time. Read, read, read. I think sometimes in English we're guilty of asking students to run before they can walk. The English language qualifications assume that students already have a good level of English, which is not always the case. For example, I teach a lot of learners who are non-native speakers. They've only been speaking English for 5 years, let's say, sometimes shorter, and they've moved here from other countries that don't have English as their first language. So it's very tricky for them to write a piece of descriptive writing or to analyse language analysis if they haven't got the words themselves in their own vocabulary. So I think sometimes we encourage students to run before they can walk, and I've always understood that. If you don't have words to express yourself, how on earth can you write a piece of descriptive writing? Um, I think about it like this. If you cut a dictionary in half and only allow students to use vocabulary beginning with A and M, it's going to be harder because you're not going to be able to have the words between N and Z. So it's like that, really. It's harder to express yourself in English if you don't have your own level of vocabulary to do so. So, and there's always a link between students that read as children and students that don't. You can always see in the levels of vocabulary who has been reading the longest. Unfortunately, if children have not been read to, if they have not read themselves, their vocabulary levels are going to be lower, and that means that will impact on their GCSEs. So, if I um, could get primary schools to do anything, it would be to get their students to read as much as possible, um, and to continue that love of reading. So you could do a sponsored readathon, you could raise money for charity, you could do things that I see on YouTube all the time in terms of 12 book challenges, so read a book a month and so on. Just allow yourself the time to read. And of course, I'm going to say this as an English teacher. Reading is fun. It allows you to learn about people, cultures. It takes you to lots of different worlds, all from the comfort of your armchair. So please do allow yourself to read. It will benefit you no end in later life. Number 6 is to spend 10 minutes a day writing something. So you could randomly pick an image from a magazine or Google image search. You could write a piece of flash fiction, or you could write a piece of description for 10 minutes, and then engage with what you have written. So to circle words that you've used with a highlighter or a pen, and then write the definitions down, and then to use those words as a way to write sentences using some more complex words. And again, that's just actively engaging with the process of learning vocabulary, and you're confronting vocabulary and not seeing it as a scary thing. So an example, I've got a picture here of a house that I found in a magazine. I've written here a piece of 10-minute flash fiction or a piece of descriptive writing. I've said to myself, I want to use the words deck, terrible, and suspicious. And then what I've done is I've found the definitions of those words. And then underneath, I've come up with some synonyms for those words. So veranda becomes a synonym of deck, apprehensive for suspicious, and abhorrent for terrible. So again, I'm engaging actively with what I've written myself as a way to confront some new words. And again, this also practices, of course, descriptive writing or writing stories, as well as punctuation and spelling and so on. Number 7, I have just called this alphabet words, which is you write A to Z down the margin of a piece of paper, and you spend 5 minutes coming up with a word that begins with that letter. And if you don't know a word, you could obviously leave a gap and find a word using a dictionary or a thesaurus. And the act of looking up a word is going to then also increase your vocabulary. This might also help with spelling. And you can also turn this into a game. For example, two of you could do it. And if you've got different words, you give each other a point. If you've got different words, you give each other a point. If you've got the same words, you can obviously give yourself a cross. So it's encouraging you to increase the level of words that you can use and have in your brain. Number 8 is to use simple, better, or best grids. So in the green, I've got some simple words. In yellow, I've got some better words. And in red, I've got some really good words. And the red column is going to be more sophisticated. This also helps with spelling, and it also helps with synonyms again, because if you do this several times, you'll begin to learn these words and then are going to be able to use them in a potential exam situation or in any piece of writing, come to think of it. Finally, using thesauruses. Thesauruses have unfortunately gone out of fashion in recent years because I'm sure we're all used to right-clicking and looking at synonyms. But a thesaurus is a paper format, and I'm sure there's apps as well out there for this. And you can buy paper versions of thesauruses for about £2 in charity shops, so they are cheap. You can choose a random page in a thesaurus, choose one word on that page, and write 4 sentences using the synonyms listed under a particular word. So here we've got the word groggy, and the synonyms listed underneath: befuddled, confused, dazed, dizzy, etc. And in those sentences A to D, I've written some new sentences using some synonyms underlined, synonyms of the word groggy. So again, I'm just exposing myself to those words and being able to grow the breadth of my vocabulary. And by doing that over time, your vocabulary will eventually grow because you are actively spending time enabling your brain to learn these words. So 9 strategies there. There were probably others as well in terms of learning vocabulary, but learning vocabulary takes time, but you've got to actively engage in the process. Sometimes reading does work, but it's not very quick. You need to be able to actively use dictionaries, thesauruses, definitions, and write your own sentences as well to learn those words. And do that over time, you're going to be in a much stronger position where you will have learnt some new words ready to use in your writing. So no quick fixes, but hopefully this gives you some ideas. Thank you for watching.